Are there any other key policy areas that you're working on or that you're concerned about?
And some of these may or may not be of interest to other Internet Society members, but spectrum is a big issue for the company. As most of you know, the National Broadband Plan that was developed by the Federal Communications Commission had a fairly significant section of it that talked about spectrum and about what kinds of things the government needed to do to encourage more spectrum to get out in the marketplace. They identified the need to come up with 500 megahertz of spectrum over the next few years. And some progress has been made. In fact, there is a legislation that just got passed this year in Congress that authorized something called incentive auctions, where essentially the idea would be to provide incentives for owners of spectrum in the broadcast area to either give up their spectrum or to move off the spectrum they're on now and move to other spectrum. And that spectrum that freed up can then be sold in the auctions at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC just came out with a notice about that process. It's a very complex process, but they are now in the process of getting comments. And so the hope is that sometime in the next year or two, they will actually have an auction of some more spectrum. There's actually a quite fair amount of evidence based on the amount of traffic that we see today in the broadband networks, especially the wireless networks, that it's growing so fast that at some point it is going to be more and more difficult for companies to handle the traffic unless they get more spectrum. So one of the ideas that you hear a lot about is something called a spectrum crunch, and I think that is possible, although Verizon has recently purchased some spectrum in what we call the secondary markets, where you can actually work with other companies that own spectrum and negotiate commercial arrangements with them to buy spectrum or to swap spectrum. And we've got enough spectrum, according to our CTO, to last for several more years and be in good shape to be able to offer 4G technology, which is the newest version. But I think all these companies, all these wireless companies, are going to face more and more constraints over time because there's just so much traffic building up with mobile devices. So that's one area we're spending a lot of time on. We also are very interested in seeing Congress look carefully at and hopefully adopt a new communications policy for the country. The old Communications Act of 1996, believe it or not, is actually pretty outdated in many areas. For example, even though the act was passed in 1996, the internet was just becoming commercial in those days, and most people didn't even know about it. So it's not even mentioned too much in the Communications Act that was adopted. And most of that act was focused on trying to encourage build out of new networks and also competition in the voice market, the voice telephone market. That's pretty much today obviously not much of an issue because there's a lot of competition in the voice market, either from Skype Online or from wireless companies. So really the focus ought to be much more on the internet and broadband policy and trying to encourage more investment and essentially a policy that encourages more innovation in that market. So we think that's an area that needs to be looked at, and we're hoping that Congress will focus on that. Cybersecurity is a really big issue. I know some Internet Society members are interested in that. In our case, we think there are two big issues there that need to be addressed by legislation. A lot of it could be done administratively, but two things require legislation. That's the ability of companies to share information on a real-time basis about cyber attacks and with the government. And the second piece is the liability piece, because today, even if companies did share information, they might be liable if they basically said, hey, look, we got a problem here and something needs to be done about it, and then that became exposed, they might be liable. So those two issues do need legislation. It's a pretty important area because a lot of dealing with cybersecurity issues and cyber attacks is being able to share information about attacks real time. Hey, we see a new signature emerging. What do you guys see? Are you seeing the same thing? What do we do about it? So that's an area of real importance to us too. And actually there's an area that people probably don't think about, or two areas that people don't think about much, but we think these kinds of things are going to be more and more important to people using the internet. And that's, as I mentioned, telematics, which is connected cars, intelligent highways, which are, because today if you look at a car, they have up to 300 computers built into them of various kinds. Wow. So a lot of that is communications. They actually are communicating already in the car to some extent with other cars, at least on a short-term basis, basis. So we think that area is really important, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is actually looking at policies in that area because part of their concern is as these communications technology become more integrated into cars, it will encourage people to drive in a distracted manner. They're worried about distracted driving. So, and that's, we agree with that. There could be some real dangers if it's not done right. But there's so much value to having connected cars, being able to deal with congestion, for example, or finding parking spaces that are intelligent in parking spaces so that actually the parking system can tell you, hey, there's 3 parking spaces here. You can get it wirelessly and drive right to the parking spot rather than to spend time driving around the city. Believe it or not, 30% of the fuel used in cities today is to find parking.
Amazing.
So, reducing those kinds of things with intelligent cars. So policies around the use of telematics, and that's just one, the area of trying to deal with distracted driving, but privacy issues will obviously emerge there as well. And then finally, healthcare. There's a huge amount of technology improvements that could be made by connecting doctors more effectively, connecting them with patients, remote and chronic monitoring of patients. And that area is just beginning to start happening. So, and there are a lot of issues there having to do with privacy again, but also having to do with things like payment. Today, a lot of the reason you don't see the technologies adopted in doctors' offices very much is because the existing Medicare and Medicaid systems don't allow compensation for doctors to use the technology.
Right.
So changing policies in that area and changing things like how we license doctors. Today, a lot of times in many states, in most states in fact, the doctor can only be licensed to deal with patients within that state. So if he did have or she had a patient in another state, they really couldn't do anything electronically because they don't have a license to do that.
Yep.
So changing those kinds of policies. And all of this could actually encourage more use of the internet, more use of our communications technologies, the kinds of technologies that Internet Society members are interested in. So those policy changes could be really important.